darkness descended upon the world in the year 536 CE. Across continents, day became winter-like gloom, crops failed, and kingdoms faltered. But this wasn't legend. It was memory, carved into the scrolls of monks, the letters of emperors, and the whispers of terrified survivors. In the words of the Byzantine historian Procopius, the sun gave forth its light without brightness. It seemed exceedingly like the sun in eclipse. For nearly 2 years, a shadow lay across the known world, and humanity stumbled blindly through a twilight that refused to lift. It began without warning. In the heart of the Mediterranean, the sky dulled to a ghostly hue. Farmers found morning frost on summer soil. In Constantinople, the heart of the Eastern Roman Empire, the great domes of Hagia Sophia glittered beneath a dim, sickly light. Emperor Justinian, who dreamed of restoring Rome's imperial glory, watched as his cities withered under a sun that had turned its face away. The signs were everywhere. In Ireland, monks chronicled a failure of bread. In China, imperial scribes recorded snow in the 6th month of the year. In the Andes, the crops failed without explanation. Each culture spoke its own language, but they all described the same phenomenon: a sky that would not brighten, a cold that would not lift, a famine that would not end. The ancient world searched for meaning. Gods were blamed, stars were consulted. In northern Europe, the sun was said to have vanished because of a war among giants. In the Christian world, and preachers declared it a sign of the end times. In Persia, the Zoroastrian priesthood warned that the darkness was the work of Angra Mainyu, the spirit of destruction. But the true cause lay not in myth, but in earth and fire. Only in recent decades did scientists uncover the catastrophe hidden beneath centuries of confusion. From the ice sheets of Greenland and Antarctica, cores were drawn, tall frozen timelines of Earth's climate. Trapped in the layers corresponding to 536 CE were spikes of volcanic sulfur. Ash, unseen for centuries, was still there. Matching signals appeared in tree rings from across the northern hemisphere. The growth had stunted. The trees, like the people, had struggled to survive. The eruption, or perhaps eruptions, that triggered this descent into darkness were massive, some of the largest in recorded history. Though the exact volcano remains debated, evidence points to a colossal blast in the northern hemisphere, possibly in Iceland. The force of the eruption sent ash high into the stratosphere, spreading a veil of dust and sulfuric aerosols around the planet. Sunlight was reflected away. Rainfall patterns collapsed. Temperatures dropped by several degrees worldwide. What followed was not a single year of hardship, but a decade of transformation. Across the Eastern Roman Empire, the cold delivered chaos. In the streets of Constantinople, famine began to grip the poor. Food prices soared. Starvation claimed those without coin or title. In Egypt, the breadbasket of the empire, harvests withered. In Syria and Anatolia, provincial governors hoarded grain. Justinian, already stretched thin by wars against the Vandals and the Ostrogoths, now faced a disaster no army could repel. In the midst of this suffering came a second blow, perhaps the most devastating of all. In 541, just 5 years after the skies darkened, the plague arrived. It began in Pelusium, Egypt, and spread with terrifying speed. Within a year, it had reached Constantinople. There, in the teeming capital of the Eastern Empire, tens of thousands died each week. The dead were heaped in piles, buried in mass graves, or dumped into the sea. The imperial court itself was not spared. Justinian fell ill but survived. His empire did not. The pandemic, the first recorded outbreak of bubonic plague, became known as the Plague of Justinian. It would recur in waves over the next 2 centuries. Combined with the climate collapse, it crippled the Eastern Empire, eroded its economy, and halted its ambitions of reconquest. Justinian's dreams of rebuilding the Roman West crumbled alongside his population. Elsewhere, the consequences were equally dire. In the Sassanid Empire, rivals to the Byzantines, the cold and famine strained resources. In China, dynasties struggled to maintain order amid crop failure and rebellion. Nomadic tribes across the steppes began to move south, pushed by hunger and drawn by the promise of warmer, richer lands. Migrations reshaped the map. The Franks expanded their influence in Gaul. The Slavs moved deeper into the Balkans. The Avars surged across the Danube. Amid this turbulence, cities shrank or transformed. In the Roman West, many urban centers were abandoned entirely. Rural populations returned to subsistence farming. The complex networks of trade, taxation, and administration that had defined Roman civilization broke down further. What had already begun in the 5th century now accelerated. The West was no longer Roman. It was something new, fragmented, localized, hardened by survival. Religion became both refuge and explanation. Christian monasticism flourished. In Gaul and Britain, remote monasteries filled with those seeking answers, or at least solace. Apocalyptic literature multiplied. Itinerant preachers warned of divine judgment. In the eastern deserts, ascetics fasted and prayed beneath the darkened sun, interpreting each day's cold as a message from heaven. Miracles were reported. Visionaries arose. But faith, while powerful, could not feed the hungry. Yet slowly, the earth began to warm again. By the mid-540s, the worst of the darkness passed. But the scars remained. Political systems had been altered. Empires had weakened. Societies had adapted, sometimes brutally. Populations were lower, trade routes thinner, knowledge lost. The year 536 is often called the worst year to be alive. Not because of a single event, but because it marked the beginning of a slow-motion catastrophe. The climate collapse, the famine, the plague, each part of a chain reaction that reshaped the ancient world. Today, scientists continue to uncover more about this forgotten disaster. With every ice core, with every archaeological dig, a clearer picture emerges, not just of suffering, but of resilience. Civilizations endured, cultures survived, humanity adapted. But for those who lived through it, the sun itself had failed. And for nearly a decade, the world wandered through that long shadow, unsure if the light would ever return. By the time the skies began to clear in the late 540s, the world was no longer what it had been. The familiar rhythms of nature had been disrupted. The empires that once ruled with absolute confidence were now fractured, anxious, and diminished. Yet even as the worst of the cold and famine began to subside, the full weight of the catastrophe had only just begun to settle. What followed the sunless years of the 530s was not renewal, but the slow, grinding consequence of population collapse, political erosion, and the reshuffling of global power. The plague had left behind cities half-empty, streets overgrown, farms abandoned. In Constantinople, where the sound of merchants and priests once echoed through the colonnaded squares, silence had become the dominant language. Families had disappeared, guilds and trades vanished, even the bureaucratic backbone of the empire was bent and broken. Imperial officials died faster than they could be replaced. Laws went unenforced. Entire tax regions ceased to function, their records lost, their collectors dead. Justinian, still seated upon his throne, attempted to govern as if nothing had changed. But the empire around him was hollow. His dream of Roman restoration had cost blood and treasure, and now disease had taken what armies could not. Though he lived through the plague, his legacy was no longer defined by victory in war, but by a new, invisible enemy that made swords irrelevant. Soldiers couldn't march if they had no bread. Generals could not conquer empty cities. Glory had turned to dust. Elsewhere, chaos invited ambition. In the West, former Roman territories became the contested ground for rising powers. The Visigoths, Franks, and Lombards each sought to fill the void left behind by Roman authority. These were not simply tribal warlords, as past histories sometimes suggest. They were political actors adapting to a crumbling world. They intermarried with Roman elites, adopted administrative systems, and ruled over both Romans and their own people. But their rise was shaped by the same forces that had leveled the empires: climate and contagion. The plague did not vanish after its first wave. Like the shadow of the earlier volcanic ash, it lingered. Waves of infection struck again and again. In some cities, it returned every 10 or 15 years. The result was a long period of demographic suppression. Populations simply could not recover. Children died young, crops went unharvested, roads fell into disrepair. Rural isolation became a defense mechanism. Villages turned inward, and contact with the wider world, once a path to trade and opportunity, now brought fear. In the Middle East, the Sassanid Empire fared no better. Their own administrative core suffered from famine, plague, and the mounting stress of governing a weakening population. Zoroastrian temples reported dwindling attendance. Religious unrest flared in the provinces. Border regions slipped from central control. And like Byzantium, the Persians faced their own succession crises, each made more dangerous by the growing weakness of the state. The two great powers of the ancient world, Rome and Persia, were both now vulnerable. China, too, bore witness to collapse and reformation. The northern and southern dynasties had been engaged in a long cycle of division and war. The cold decades of the mid-6th century deepened that instability. Famine became a tool of rebellion. Banditry spread. Officials defected. In the north, the Wei dynasty gave way to fragmentation and infighting. In the south, natural disasters compounded political failure. Though the Sui dynasty would eventually reunify China in 589, it did so over the grave of millions, in a land reshaped by 2 decades of environmental and social trauma. But in the ashes of collapse, seeds of transformation began to stir. The emptiness left by the plague and the cold forced innovation. In Gaul, local kings began to codify laws for their new hybrid populations, part Roman, part Frankish. The Salic law, one of the earliest such codes, attempted to impose order where chaos had reigned. It was crude, yes, but it was a beginning, a sign that new systems were emerging to replace the fallen imperial ones. Religious institutions became more than spiritual centers. They became governments, schools, granaries, and hospitals. In the absence of imperial authority, bishops governed cities. Monasteries became centers of learning and literacy, preserving classical knowledge while also developing new theological frameworks to explain the suffering of the age. This period, often labeled a dark age, was not without light. It simply shifted the source of that light, from emperors to monks, from palaces to cloisters. Travel became perilous, but it did not cease entirely. The Silk Road, though strained, continued to carry goods and ideas across the continents. Merchants adapted, using safer routes or smaller caravans. Pilgrims still journeyed to holy sites, though with greater caution. And with them, stories traveled of strange weather, vanished cities, and diseases that turned the body black. Oral history preserved what parchment sometimes did not. In Arabia, the consequences of this global transformation were subtle but profound. Trade routes that once passed through Byzantine and Persian lands now diverted southward. As the great powers weakened, local Arab tribes gained greater autonomy. The city of Mecca, once a provincial market, began to rise in importance. New alliances formed. And into this changing world would soon step a new prophet with a new message, shaped in part by the instability of the era that preceded him. The old world had not ended. It had been reconfigured. But the trauma remained close. In the writings of Gregory of Tours, one reads of constant funerals, towns reduced to rubble, and miracle after miracle proclaimed by desperate voices. The earth had betrayed its people, and many did not forget. Yet the human spirit, stubborn and restless, endured. Farmers replanted, builders rebuilt. Songs were written about lost cities. Children were born under clearer skies. The sun had returned, and with it, a cautious hope. Still, historians today see the 530s and 40s as a dividing line, a moment when the ancient world gave way to something entirely new. The empires that had seemed eternal proved fragile. The systems that had governed millions shattered under the weight of nature's indifference. And yet, in that shattering, new patterns emerged. This was not a collapse like the sudden fall of a tower, but the slow erosion of an age. It moved like frost over glass, reshaping everything it touched. What rose in its place would define the next 1,000 years of history. And beneath the modern cities, in the layers of earth and ice, the evidence remains. Blackened tree rings, frozen ash, and the skeletal remains of those who lived and died in the shadow of the year 536. Their world changed in darkness. Ours, perhaps, was born from it. As the darkness lifted and the 6th century edged forward, the people of the old empires looked around at a world transformed beyond recognition. A new reality had set in, one defined not by grand armies and marble cities, but by survival, adaptation, and a slow reckoning with loss. The fragile stability that had once existed under Rome's banners was gone. What remained was a fractured landscape of ghost towns, overgrown roads, and hollowed-out institutions. Yet history does not pause. Even as the ash settled and the plague receded, the wheel of time turned. The survivors, marked by trauma but driven by necessity, began to build new structures atop the ruins. And though the emperors and kings still claimed titles, the true power was shifting elsewhere. To religion, to the countryside, to the margins of the known world. In Constantinople, Justinian clung to the throne like a specter of an older age. His ambitions of imperial reconquest were smothered by disease and debt. By the end of the 540s, he was ruling over an empire battered by repeated waves of plague and increasingly isolated provinces. The taxes continued, but the flow of wealth slowed. Former allies had become burdens. Revolts simmered in North Africa. Italy, retaken from the Goths at enormous cost, was now a wasteland of bones and shattered aqueducts. The West was no longer a battleground for empire. It had become a graveyard of it. In Gaul, the Merovingian kings established their courts among the ruins of Roman cities. These new monarchs wore the titles of Rome, but practiced a very different kind of rule. Power was local, personal, and often brutal. Feuds and vendettas shaped the political landscape more than policy. Yet even this decentralized authority offered a strange kind of resilience. Where the Roman bureaucracy had collapsed under the weight of plague and famine, the Merovingian kingdoms, rooted in kinship and tradition, endured. In Britain, the story was even more fragmented. The Roman administration had vanished a century earlier, and in its absence, small kingdoms had risen across the island. Angles, Saxons, Jutes, Britons, all vying for land and dominance. There, too, the cold years had left their mark. Crops failed, settlements shrank. But the chaos also created space for cultural transformation. Christian missionaries would soon arrive from Ireland and Gaul, preaching to a land that barely remembered the Latin tongue. The seeds of medieval England were planted in this soil of collapse. Across the Mediterranean, trade routes had faltered but not disappeared. The old Roman shipping lanes still carried goods, though fewer and at greater risk. Pirates flourished, ports declined. Grain shipments from Egypt to Constantinople became infrequent and unreliable. The once thriving commercial hubs of the Levant, Tyre, Sidon, Caesarea, faced decline as the broader economic web unraveled. The eastern provinces, which had escaped the worst of the 5th century invasions, now bore the brunt of the 6th century calamities. Religion filled the gaps where the state could no longer reach. In Egypt, the Coptic Church grew in influence as the imperial government retreated. In Syria, monks established fortified monasteries that served as both spiritual centers and community refuges. In Italy, Rome became more than a relic. It became a beacon of spiritual authority. The Bishop of Rome, once one of many patriarchs, began to emerge as a singular moral voice in a fractured world. Papal letters spoke not just to theology, but to famine, violence, and governance. Apocalyptic thinking was not merely a cultural expression. It became a framework for understanding reality. From Constantinople to Cordoba, people interpreted the endless cycles of death and disaster as signs of divine judgment. In sermons and scrolls, the sins of empires were blamed for the wrath of heaven. A moral reordering was underway. Wealth and power were no longer seen as signs of divine favor, but as temptations leading to ruin. Asceticism flourished. Hermits, saints, and holy fools were revered as guardians of truth in a world gone mad. But even in devastation, the human urge to record, to chronicle, to remember, did not die. Gregory of Tours, living in the decaying heart of Gaul, wrote his history of the Franks, a strange mixture of miracle stories, political intrigue, and brutal realism. His pages are filled with plagues, murders, and divine portents. Yet they offer one of the clearest windows into the soul of the 6th century, a world unsure whether it was ending or being remade. Further east, in the steppes and deserts beyond the empire's reach, other forces stirred. The Avars, a Turkic nomadic group displaced by the same chain of climate disruption, migrated westward. They encountered and eventually dominated parts of Central Europe. Their movement was not an isolated event. It was part of a wider reshuffling of the world's margins, driven in part by the same environmental chaos that had darkened the skies of Rome and Persia. In Arabia, the shifting trade routes created by the weakening of Byzantine and Sasanian power opened new corridors for influence. The city of Mecca, already a religious center, gained increased commercial importance. Tribes began to form broader alliances, seeking security and unity. Though the great revelation of Islam had not yet occurred, the world that would receive it was already being forged, shaped by environmental disaster, political collapse, and spiritual hunger. The old order, it seemed, had not been replaced. It had dissolved. In its place, networks of local power rose. Cities ruled by bishops, towns guarded by tribal chieftains, valleys defended by fortified monasteries. The centralized state, once the hallmark of imperial civilization, gave way to patchwork sovereignties, more responsive to immediate need, more brutal in justice, and more insular in identity. And yet, amid all this loss, there was innovation. The collapse of long-distance trade forced communities to become self-reliant. Local industries revive. Pottery, textiles, metalwork, all were produced anew, often in smaller quantities, but with unique regional styles. In Gaul, Merovingian glassmakers developed their own techniques. In Britain, monasteries became centers of book production. What had once been imported was now made by hand, often by those who had never seen the cities their ancestors once served. The climate began to stabilize by the 550s and 560s. But the psychological impact of the crisis lingered. Generations had grown up knowing only hardship. Children born during the sunless years were now adults, shaped by famine, plague, and fear. Their memories were etched into their worldview. For them, the past was not a golden age. It was a warning. And their responses were accordingly cautious, local, and often deeply spiritual. This was the foundation of what we now call the early Middle Ages. Not a time of ignorance or cultural death, but of transformation under pressure. The world had been hammered by forces beyond comprehension: volcanic fury, shifting climate, microbial invasion. And it had survived. But it had not emerged unchanged. In the years to come, new empires would rise from these ashes. New religions would shape continents. But the trauma of the 6th century would echo through it all. A quiet reminder, buried in legend and scripture, that civilization is fragile, and that the sun does not always rise. In the decades that followed the great crisis of the mid-6th century, a new pattern of life began to emerge. Though the volcanic skies had cleared and the dead from the plague were buried, the echoes of that dark time remained embedded in the rhythms of everyday existence. Fear had become part of culture. Memory was inherited like land. And slowly, the ancient world that had once seemed eternal faded into legend, while a new world, uncertain and still forming, took its place. The former pillars of empire, laws, infrastructure, diplomacy, had grown brittle. Roman roads were overgrown, their stonework pried apart to build farm walls or monasteries. Aqueducts cracked and collapsed. Urban populations, once the pride of civilization, shrank into defensive enclaves. Cities that had once housed hundreds of thousands now held only a fraction of their former numbers. In many regions, people no longer lived in cities at all. Instead, the countryside became the center of life. Survival depended on land and livestock. Small settlements, often centered around a church or fortified manor, became the new norm. Authority came from proximity. A man who could defend his village with a dozen swords had more power than a distant emperor whose envoys no longer arrived. This was not an age of administration. It was an age of relationships, oaths, and protection. But even as central governance faded, culture did not die. It adapted. Latin, the language of empire, fractured into regional dialects, early forms of French, Spanish, and Italian, spoken by people who no longer saw themselves as Romans, but as something else. Laws were rewritten in the tongues of new kings. Coins bore unfamiliar faces. The empire was not destroyed in a single moment, but diluted until it no longer recognized itself. In the east, Constantinople remained intact, though not unscarred. Justinian died in 565, having outlived many of the generals, nobles, and clergy who had once surrounded him. His successors inherited a strained empire, militarily stretched, economically weakened, and religiously divided. Efforts to enforce orthodoxy had alienated many of the empire's subjects, especially in Egypt and Syria, where theological disputes took on political dimensions. The population losses from the plague and the long cold had also weakened the Byzantine economy. Cities struggled to maintain public works. The vast civil service shrank. Military recruitment became more difficult, and the empire's borders became harder to defend. The vast ambitions of Justinian had reduced the state's reserves to a flicker of what they had been. To the east, the Sassanid Empire faced similar pressures. Though it had avoided the full scale of the plague's devastation early on, it too was exhausted by war, famine, and economic strain. Political intrigues in the Persian court grew deadly. Coups and assassinations became regular. The great fire temples grew quieter as public confidence in royal power waned. Neither empire could know it yet, but the age of their rivalry was drawing to a close. The long cold had weakened both, and new forces would soon rise from the Arabian Peninsula to challenge the old order completely. But before that future unfolded, the 6th century had one final blow to deliver. In 626, nearly a century after the year 536 plunged the world into darkness, the city of Constantinople found itself under siege, this time by the combined forces of the Avars and the Sassanids. The city's defenses held, but barely. The siege was the culmination of years of attrition. The empire was no longer the power it had once been. The failure of the attackers bought the Byzantines time, but not peace. Just a few years later, the Prophet Muhammad would begin to unify the tribes of Arabia. By 632, the year of his death, much of the peninsula was united under Islam, and as the new faith expanded beyond its birthplace, it encountered two exhausted giants: Rome in the east, Persia in the west, both weakened by decades of internal decay and external pressure. The conquests that followed were not solely military. They were also cultural, spiritual, and economic. The Islamic caliphates, energized by a sense of divine mission and free from the burdens of a crumbling imperial legacy, rapidly overtook vast territories that the Byzantines and Persians had failed to hold together. Syria, Egypt, and Mesopotamia, all lands where the long shadow of 536 had struck hard, fell under new rulers. And yet, this was not merely the rise of a new power. It was a turning of the page. The age that had begun under the sunless sky was now ending. Not with a final collapse, but with transformation. The people who lived in this time may not have understood the full scope of what was happening around them. Few could see beyond their own village, their own borders, or their own desperate needs. But in fragments, through letters, chronicles, inscriptions, they left behind a record of something immense. A monk in Gaul wrote of seeing fields untended for 20 years. A Syriac scribe lamented the death of scholars whose libraries had turned to dust. An Egyptian farmer, recorded only in tax records, disappeared after the famine years, his land unclaimed, his name forgotten. These are not the famous names of history. They are not kings or generals. They are not saints. But their absence speaks louder than any battle. Their empty fields, broken tools, and unfinished buildings testify to a world that endured too much, too quickly, with too little understanding. And yet, humanity endured. The very decentralization that fractured the empire also allowed new, more localized cultures to thrive. Art shifted. Iconography grew bolder, less rigid. Music changed. Agricultural techniques adapted to colder climates. New hybrid languages developed, blending Old Latin with Germanic sounds and syntax. In the East, Persian administrative practices left their mark on the early caliphates, even as Arabic became the language of learning and law. The ancient world, with its clear hierarchies and vast cities, was gone. But something else had taken its place, something more flexible, more adaptable, more diverse. In the soil left behind by catastrophe, the roots of the medieval world grew. Not everything was recovery. Not everything was rebirth. Much was simply different. The people who emerged from the long, dark century of 536 to 636 CE were not the same as those who had entered it. They believed different things. They valued different things. They feared different things. And in their bones, in their stories, in the way they faced the world, one truth remained. The sun had failed them once, and they would never forget. By the early 7th century, a quiet but irreversible shift had occurred. The world that had trembled beneath the darkened skies of 536 was now a different world altogether. In the minds of those who lived through it, the memories were still vivid. A sun that offered no light, a cold that gnawed through summer, fields that yielded nothing but dust, and the silence of streets emptied by plague. These memories didn't fade. They calcified, passed down through generations as warnings, omens, and whispered truths. Even as life resumed its rhythm, the imprint of catastrophe lingered. The ancient networks that once connected distant lands had fractured, not only physically, but psychologically. Trust had broken. Trade had slowed. Isolation had become a kind of protection. Many communities turned inward, wary of outsiders, haunted by the belief that the next disaster might arrive not from the sky, but from the road. And yet, something astonishing happened. In that broken, post-imperial landscape, people began to build again, not in imitation of the past, but in defiance of it. What emerged from the ruins was not a resurgence of what had been, but a mosaic of new forms, smaller, more localized, yet resilient and often surprisingly sophisticated. In Northern Europe, Christianity began to spread not from Rome, but from the fringes. Irish monks sailed across treacherous waters to evangelize pagan kingdoms. In Anglo-Saxon England, where Rome's memory had all but vanished, new Christian centers of learning were founded from scratch. The monasteries of Iona, Lindisfarne, and Canterbury became not only places of prayer, but repositories of language, art, and memory. These monasteries preserved what they could of the old world: Latin texts, fragments of Greek science, Roman legal ideas, while also creating new cultural forms. Intricate illuminated manuscripts, such as the Book of Kells, emerged from cold stone cloisters. Their swirling patterns and vibrant colors spoke not of decline, but of imagination, of persistence in the face of loss. Meanwhile, in the former heartlands of the Roman East and Persian West, a profound transformation was underway. Within decades of Muhammad's death in 632, Arab armies swept across the Levant, Persia, and North Africa. The speed of their expansion was breathtaking. but so too was the coherence of what followed. Under the Rashidun and Umayyad caliphates, administrative structures were established, languages standardized, and cities like Damascus and later Baghdad rose as new centers of power. The Islamic world did not simply conquer, it absorbed, restructured, and reimagined. It inherited the wisdom of Greece, Persia, and India, translating and preserving ancient texts that might otherwise have been lost forever. Medicine, astronomy, mathematics, all were revitalized under new patronage. The same lands that had suffered plague and famine now buzzed with intellectual energy. The trauma had not erased knowledge. It had shifted its center of gravity. Even in the scarred remnants of Byzantium, the story was not one of simple decline. After the siege of 626 and the devastating wars with Persia, the empire reeled. But it did not fall. Instead, it contracted and adapted. Gone were the dreams of reconquest. In their place came survival strategies, military reforms, a more religiously rigid society, and a capital that focused on defense rather than grandeur. Constantinople, battered but not broken, became a fortress city. Behind its towering walls, it would endure for centuries more, a flickering beacon of the Roman legacy in a world that no longer looked Roman. The Byzantines, shaped by trauma, grew harder, more insular, but also more enduring. The Eastern Roman Empire would outlast its Western counterpart by nearly 1,000 years, a testament to adaptation born in fire and ash. Yet across all these regions, from the forests of Gaul to the deserts of Arabia, one common thread ran beneath the surface. The legacy of the 6th century catastrophe had embedded itself into human consciousness. It became part of religious memory, part of folklore, part of how the world was understood. In Christian Europe, the idea of the apocalypse took on new urgency. The book of Revelation was read not as metaphor, but as recent memory. The four horsemen, war, famine, pestilence, and death, had already ridden through the world, leaving their tracks in every field and churchyard. In the Islamic world, too, the memory of the recent chaos influenced theology and law. Order was sacred, knowledge a defense against future uncertainty. Scholarship flourished not just as curiosity, but as preparation, as a way to anchor civilization against whatever storms might come next. The cultural responses varied, but the underlying impulse was the same. Never again. Never again should humanity be caught unprepared. Never again should ignorance be allowed to rule. And so, beneath the ashes of one age, the foundations of the next were laid. The centuries that followed would bring their own trials, new plagues, wars, famines, but none would be received with the same shock. The memory of 536 had taught something essential: that civilization is not a given. It must be rebuilt constantly, defended not just by walls and swords, but by knowledge, cooperation, and humility before nature. Modern science, peering into the ice of Greenland and the rings of ancient trees, has only recently begun to understand the full scale of what happened in that terrible decade. The volcanoes, hidden for centuries, have been identified. The cooling measured, the evidence clear. What was once considered myth or religious exaggeration is now understood as one of the greatest environmental disasters in recorded history. But long before science caught up, the survivors already knew. They knew because they had lived without sunlight. They knew because they had buried half their families. They knew because they had walked through cities where the only sound was the wind. They didn't need to name the volcano or understand the climate cycle or map the spread of plague. They only needed to remember. And they did. In the prayers they whispered, in the stories they passed on, in the wary way they watched the sky. A century after the ash fell, a monk in a hilltop monastery recorded a strange sunrise. Red, swollen, slow to rise. He wrote no panic, only a single line. May it not be as before. It wasn't. The worst had passed, but the lesson endured. History forgets many things, but not the day the sun failed.